a trustee at Cranford United Methodist Church.
And one of the best nature photographers you'll ever find in your life.
Oh, yeah? True.
Yes.
Very true.
Speaking of nature, you know, the eagle on top of the flagpole, that's a very majestic pose. Anybody know what the eagle, whether eagles actually have that pose or not? They do. It's after they go into the river to catch fish. They pose like that in the sun to dry off. So if that spoils a little bit for you, sorry about that. I have a little bit of show and tell as the very first part of my discussion, which is not history, it's prehistory. So in this bag is just a rock of quartzite, and then there's a scraping tool and 2 points that were found here on the Cranford Cemetery site. Some of you may know, some of you may not know, if you're not familiar with Mason Neck, that the Fairfax County archaeologist has done surveys out here in a number of locations, not on this site per se, but elsewhere on Mason Neck, and that artifacts as old as 12,000 years ago have been found from what were then hunter-gatherers. The pieces I'm passing around would be dated around 5,000 years ago, even before Dick's time. Like I say, the rock is quartzite, and I think I mentioned that's about 1.5 billion years old. Again, at least that's before Dick's time. The archaeologists have dated the invention of the bow and arrow worldwide at about 71 to 64,000 years ago. But they didn't show up, bows and arrows didn't show up in this part of North America until about 700 AD, which is why we know that the points in that bag that you'll see are either probably spear points or could be knife points. So there was no arrowheads at that time. The descendants of those early hunter-gatherers that were right in this area became later, of course, the Native American tribes that we know of by their names, the Powhatan, Algonquin, Iroquois, and some of the smaller tribes of the Piscataway, Wootaway, Dogue, and Nanticoke. Now, Dogue is particularly known here on Mason Neck. So I'm going to jump from prehistory up to history. From about 1608 to August of 1609, Captain John Smith led his exploration along the rivers of Virginia, including the Potomac River, and flew right on past here by Mason Neck. His maps indicate that ships sailed north of here up towards what is now Washington. In the late 1600s, an Englishman named Thomas Barton and his family lived right up here near the flagpole, right here on the cemetery site. A county historical marker on Gunston Road, and you've probably seen there's 3 of them down there, but who has time to stop and read those? The historical marker about that says, quote, certain unknown Indians attacked the house of Thomas Barton about 3 p.m. on Sunday, 16 June, 1700, killing 8 persons with arrows and wooden tomahawks. The neighboring Piscataway Indians denied making the attack and blamed the Wotoways. The Indians involved probably were angered by the colonial encroachment on their land and may have been encouraged by the French. Lieutenant Colonel George Mason wrote Governor Francis Nicholson that this murder was the horriblest that ever was in present-day Fairfax County, then part of Stafford County. Mason increased the number of militia patrols, but the Indians escaped, unquote. Sometime prior to 1724, the first permanent church, part of the Church of England, in the colony of Virginia was established north of the Occoquan River, what we call Old Colchester now. And it was referred to specifically as the Mother Church of Northern Virginia. I mentioned that one because that church, that congregation, later moved from Old Colchester up to where our flagpole is here, right on the cemetery grounds. And that was done in 1730. The church then became known as Pohick Church because of its proximity to Pohick Creek. George Washington's map of the area locates this long-lost wooden edifice near exactly where that telephone pole is. Fast forward to 1765, the old Pohick Church, it was a wooden frame structure, began to show symptoms of decay, and the question of rebuilding or removal became an issue before the vestry of the church. George Washington, who was a member of the church, who would have walked on these grounds, favored a removal of the old building and moving to a different site, something more central, at least in his mind. George Mason of Gunston Hall opposed the removal. Just incidentally, George Mason would have to go further if the church was moved, and George Washington wouldn't have to go as far to travel to get to the church. And even a half a mile in those days could be a 30-minute difference in time travel. Needless to say, Washington got his way. Armed with survey maps, Washington was said to have argued for the new site on Kings Highway, where now the Pohick Church is located. But because of the dispute, the church had been there for, up here on on the corner here for quite a while, and there's a graveyard there, and there, the members of the church, their ancestors and relatives and whatnot were buried there. So one of the issues that George Mason raised was, wait a minute, we're going to leave our ancestors? Well, George Washington apparently was persuasive. This is even before he was general of Washington. It was certainly before he was president. Apparently he was still persuasive in those days. And he convinced them, here's what we'll do. We will take the markers for all of our ancestors with us, which is what happened. They moved the markers to what is now Pohick Church on Route 1, and they left all the bodies. Well, who wants to dig up a 50 or 60-year-old remains? That's what happened. Okay. Cover all that. Now, what's interesting is the cemetery was established in 1730, and there was some records of people being buried there before then, and even after what was then Pohick Church moved, there were records of people being buried there after that church and before the Methodist Church got established here. That issue that will become important later. There are certainly, it's well known that there are burial sites for slaves on Mason Neck. We don't know that there were any right here near the church, but they could have been. In 1781, the colonial army under George Washington and General Rochambeau of France traveled from New York and the New Jersey area to Yorktown. And when they did, as some of you may know, they traveled right down Old Colchester Road. That was part of their way down to Yorktown before the victory at Yorktown. During the War of 1812, British naval ships sailed up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C., passing Mason Neck on the way. It's entirely possible that landing parties may have come ashore on Mason Neck to take on fresh water and or scout the area. Likewise, American units may have had reconnaissance units tracking British naval movements. One of the oldest gravestones in the cemetery is located near where the Pohick Church had been. The gravestone pertains to Thomas and Clark, who died March 8th, 1842, and he was 51 years old. His grave attests to at least one use of the cemetery at a time between the two churches being established. Others of unknown nationality may also have been buried in the cemetery at the time. In 1857, the first Methodist church in the area was built. James and John Cranford did much of the work on the new church. The spot selected for it was the former location of Old Pohick Church. When the new church was dedicated, it received the name of Lewis Chapel. That's this building you're in right this minute. And again, it was originally located up there near the flagpole. Now, there's another historical marker that's down there on Gunston Road that reads, on February 24th, 1862, during the war between the states, an unknown Confederate unit attacked Union pickets about a mile beyond Pohick Church at Lewis Chapel. Although the Confederate force was not identified, the Southern drums were heard all along the Union picket line. There were 2 regiments of about 12,000 Union troops. Excuse me, 1,200. On outpost duty, the two regiments from Brigadier General Isaac Richardson's brigade advanced to support the troops at Lewis Chapel, and a battery of Union artillery was also sent from headquarters. General Richardson personally went to Lewis Chapel to take command if necessary. The attack really didn't amount to much. The only damage reported was that the telegraph lines around Lewis Chapel were down. What wasn't recorded then is that there are actually mini balls from that skirmish in the walls of this building, but we can't see them now because we've since put siding over it. There are 5 Confederate soldiers that were known to be buried on what is now the Cranford Cemetery, representing 3 separate Confederate units. There are grave markers for 2 of the soldiers, both of whom lived. 2 of the grave markers had lived into the 20th century, and they're markers for them. Records for the other 3 indicate they lived after the end of the Civil War. Records of 4 Union soldiers were also buried in that cemetery, but we don't know exactly where. Now, you'll hear about that in a second. The cemetery includes marked grave sites dating to the period of 1898, the time of the Spanish-American War, but we don't know whether or not any veterans from that war are buried there. Records do indicate that veterans from the First and Second War are buried here, the Korean War, and veterans of Vietnam War.
So there is a veteran from 1812.
Okay.
21 veterans total we're aware of from 1812 all the way up through present time.
Yeah, there's it's called Wreaths Across America or Hands Across America, a ceremony that occasionally is done. And a few years ago, we had such a ceremony done by one of the honor groups from Fort Belvoir, representing all the services. And it was interesting to have them here to go down the litany of the names of veterans that we have that are buried in the cemetery, and also list all the wars that they had been in. Up to the mid-1980s, there were still grave markers in the older section that is closer to Old Colchester Road in the cemetery, but the cemetery was not well maintained. Around 1985, a cleanup of the cemetery was conducted by a Boy Scout troop, but they didn't get very good guidance on what to do or not to do. As a consequence, many of the early grave markers that were just large stones, the boys didn't know what they were, so they thought they should be rolled away, and that's what happened. So the graves are there, but no markers. And these would have been graves of those buried in the latter half of the 19th century. The markers for 3 Confederate soldiers and the 4 Union soldiers were probably amongst those markers that were removed. The church sanctuary, the main building now, was completed in 1900. This building, Lewis Hall, had been up there. It was moved here in 1953, and that same year, the adjoining offices and hallway that combined the 2 structures was also built in 1953. If I have your rapt attention, there's a little piece that I thought you might find interesting. It contains the flags that would legitimately could have been flown over this part of Northern Virginia, and in some cases right here. The first known flags to be flown in Virginia in this area were those of the British Empire from the 1600s until the American Revolution. After 1776, there were 16 official variations of the U.S. flag until the war between the states. that number of 16 does not include the unofficial versions of the Stars and Stripes that had varying patterns for the stars. During the Civil War, there were a multiplicity of flags of various sizes, shapes, and designs and colors. The primary Union Civil War flag era flags were the United States flag, known as the Stars and Stripes, or national colors, and then there were regimental colors. The Confederate States of America had 3 different national flags over the course of the 4 years. These national flags were also used as battle flags by some Confederate unions. Today, the most recognizable Confederate flag is not one of the South's national flags, but was either the Confederate States Navy Jack or their similar Army of Tennessee battle flag. The Army of Northern Virginia battle flag was also of the same design, but it was square, not a rectangle. So not all Confederate national flags were accepted or flown by all military units within the Confederacy. On both the Union and Confederate sides, there were corps, brigades, regimental flags, and flags for various branches of each military service. There were various ethnic militias that fought on both sides, notably Irish and German units, each with their own flags. The flags of the Irish militias on the Confederate side and on the Union side were green, although with different designs. In 1861, Virginia seceded from the Union, making the land of Lewis Chapel, now Cranford, part of the Confederate States of America. To protect the capital, Union military forces extended into Virginia into an area just south of the Occoquan property, closer to where Old Colchester is. The church and cemetery site therefore remained under the U.S. flag for that time, and not under any of the Confederate national flags, notwithstanding the brief skirmish of February 24th, 1862, involving Confederate troops at Lewis Chapel. After 1865 and up to the present time, there were 11 variations of the official U.S. flag, with the 11th being the 50-star flag. So that's a lot of versions of flags over the course of the U.S.'s history. Virginia has had 5 different flags from its time as a colony to present day. So why do I bring all that up? Sometime around 2008, Cranford received a letter from the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, Virginia Division. The letter indicated awareness of the Confederate grave sites here and asked whether or not a Confederate flag, although a small one, could be put over the burial site to honor the veterans, right out here. So the trustees had to think about how they wanted to respond to that. And our answer was, let's look at the entire history of the site, not just of all the different flags that flew over the site, but all the different nationalities of the people who were buried there. British, Americans, probably French, and we don't know who else. So what was pointed out in the answer back to that organization is that specifically honoring just the Confederate soldiers with the Confederate flag would be considered dishonoring both the Union and other veterans buried there either before or after the Civil War. The Cranford trustees concluded that having a multitude of flags all over the cemetery would be inappropriate for the cemetery and create an appearance of disunity. So the trustees stated that they considered that the current U.S. flag does in fact represent all of the history here and all who are buried there, no matter their background. So the request was denied, and the issue has not come up again. I'm not a historian, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a former government employee, so you can believe as much of that as you want. All right, for those of you who are history people, tell me which president had the greatest impact on the White House?
Truman.
This is not an opinion, this is a matter of fact.
Truman.
Madison.
Washington.
Let me give you a hint.
Roosevelt.
His descendant, one of his descendant, used to live on Indian Spring Farms.
That's right down my.
William Howard Taft IV.
Yes.
The president had the greatest impact on the White House was William Howard Taft.
His descendant used to come into the polling.
Why?
Yeah.
He was over 300 pounds. Nobody could have a greater impact than he did.
I was gonna say that, and I thought it was a